On an October morning in 1823, shrouded in fog, the residents of Charleston County, South Carolina, discovered something destined to haunt their community for generations. Overnight, from the Ravencroft plantation, 7 enslaved individuals had vanished. Left behind were only their shackles and a single, blood-stained document bearing the seal of Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft. A web of betrayal, greed, and calculated cruelty reaching into the highest circles of Southern society would be exposed by what authorities found in that document. Fortunes have been spent by the Ravencroft family for nearly 2 centuries to keep this story buried. But the true horror of what became known as the Wedding Gift Massacre is now revealed by recently discovered correspondence. Not just his own family, but the power structure of an entire region would be reshaped by the truth about Colonel Ravencroft's gift to his bride. Before we continue with the story of Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft and his deadly matrimonial arrangement, be sure you're subscribed to our channel for more dark historical mysteries. And in the comments, let us know what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow history enthusiasts who appreciate the shadows of America's past. The most damning piece of evidence of human calculation I have ever witnessed was how Charleston's mayor would later describe the document that survived that terrible night. But to understand its true meaning, we must journey back to where this nightmare began. Everything the antebellum South aspired to become was represented by Charleston County in 1822. Like green seas, cotton plantations stretched across the landscape, their profits funding grand mansions and elaborate social gatherings that mimicked European aristocracy. Few among the plantation elite commanded more respect than Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft, a man whose military service in the War of 1812 had earned him both substantial government land grants and honor. The calculating mind of a born strategist was possessed by Ravencroft. Standing well over 6 feet tall with a precisely groomed beard and penetrating grey eyes, he commanded attention in every room he entered. The authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience was carried in his voice, whether from the 200 enslaved individuals who worked his vast cotton fields or soldiers under his command. A man of rigid principles and unwavering determination was how those who knew him described him, qualities that had built his fortune and would ultimately orchestrate his downfall. Over 3,000 acres of prime South Carolina soil were encompassed by the Ravencroft plantation, worked by enslaved families who had served the family for generations. Unlike many plantation owners who viewed their human property merely as economic units, detailed records on every individual were maintained by Ravencroft: their skills, their family connections, their personal histories, and, most disturbingly, their estimated monetary value, updated monthly based on market conditions and physical capabilities. From one of Savannah's most prominent families came his bride-to-be, Miss Cordelia Peaton. At 23, she possessed both an inheritance that would substantially increase the Ravencroft holdings and the refined education expected of a Southern lady. A perfect union of military honor and old plantation money was how their engagement, announced in the spring of 1822, was celebrated. That Cordelia harbored ambitions extending far beyond the traditional role of a plantation wife was something the wedding guests could not have known. Unusual interest in the management aspects of plantation life had been expressed by Cordelia during their courtship, conducted through formal visits and carefully chaperoned walks through Ravencroft's gardens. While most ladies of her station concerned themselves with household management and social obligations, detailed questions about crop yields, labor organization, and profit margins were asked by her. Impressed by her business acumen, Ravencroft began sharing information typically reserved for male associates and potential business partners. A woman whose intelligence matched her beauty emerged, but whose moral compass had been warped by a childhood surrounded by immense wealth built on human suffering. Not just through cotton, but through the buying and selling of enslaved individuals across multiple states had Cordelia's father, Horatio Peaton, made his fortune. Human beings as commodities to be traded, bred, and disposed of according to market demands was how she had grown up viewing them. The social event of the season was what their wedding, scheduled for October 1822, promised to be. To plantation families from Virginia to Louisiana, invitations went out, and preparations began for a celebration that would last 3 days. No expense was spared by Ravencroft, importing French champagne, hiring musicians from New Orleans, and even commissioning a special set of china from England, bearing the combined Ravenscroft and Peaton family crests. But as the wedding approached, a request was made by Cordelia that would set in motion a chain of events to destroy everything Ravenscroft had built. For something no Southern bride had ever requested as a wedding gift, she asked her fiancé during a private dinner in September. Complete ownership and control over 7 specific enslaved individuals from his plantation. In Ravenscroft's private study, a room lined with military maps, family portraits, and ledgers documenting every aspect of his plantation empire, the conversation took place. Outside, September thunder rolled across the cotton fields as Cordelia presented her unusual request with the same calm precision she might use to discuss menu selections or flower arrangements. "My dear Thaddeus," she began, her voice carrying an undertone that made the colonel shift uncomfortably in his leather chair, "I have been considering how best to contribute to our household's prosperity after our marriage. Greater service than you might expect is what I believe I can be of." With disturbing clinical detail, Ravenscroft listened as his bride-to-be outlined her proposal. She wanted 7 specific individuals, a family unit consisting of parents, 3 adult children, and 2 grandchildren, transferred to her complete ownership through legal documents that would make her their sole master, independent of her husband's authority. Both personal and profitable was her reasoning, she explained. "These 7 represent a perfect experimental group," Cordelia continued, producing a leather portfolio filled with detailed notes about each individual. "Valuable skills in blacksmithing and textile work are possessed by the older generation. A woman with exceptional ability in herbal medicine and healing and a man with remarkable strength suited for the heaviest field work are included in the middle generation. Young enough to be molded according to new training methods I have researched are the children." The true nature of her experimental methods was what Cordelia did not initially reveal. Through correspondence with contacts in Cuba and Brazil, plantation management techniques considered too extreme even by antebellum Southern standards had been learned by her. These methods involved systematic psychological manipulation, controlled breeding programs, and punishment systems designed to break not just individual will, but family bonds that might interfere with absolute obedience. In an unprecedented situation, Ravenscroft found himself. Fundamental assumptions about marriage roles and property ownership that formed the bedrock of Southern society were challenged by Cordelia's request. Typically, household slaves were managed by wives, but field hands were not owned by them independently. Nor did they involve themselves in the brutal calculations required for maximum labor extraction. Yet he was also intrigued by her business proposal. Unpredictably, cotton prices had been fluctuating, and ways to increase efficiency and reduce costs were being sought by plantation owners throughout the region. If Cordelia's methods proved successful, substantial margins could potentially increase profits by applying them across his entire labor force. Over several nights of discussion, what they called the Peaton method was developed by them, a comprehensive system for managing enslaved individuals that would maximize both psychological control and productivity. As test subjects, the 7 chosen individuals would serve, and whether the methods would be expanded plantation-wide after the wedding would be determined by their responses. Complex legal arrangements proved to be required, and discretion that extended beyond normal business confidentiality was needed. Charleston attorney Marcus Bellwether, a man known for handling sensitive plantation legal matters with absolute discretion, was retained by Ravenscroft. Documents that would transfer complete ownership of the 7 individuals to Cordelia upon their marriage were drawn up by Bellwether, with provisions that would keep the arrangement secret from local authorities and other plantation owners. A clause Cordelia insisted upon was what made the arrangement particularly sinister. To a remote section of the plantation, the 7 individuals would be relocated, where her experiments could proceed without observation by visitors or interference from other enslaved workers. Both living quarters and a location for implementing the new management techniques would be served by a separate building disguised as a textile workshop. That his bride's unusual request represented forward-thinking business innovation rather than calculated cruelty was what Ravenscroft convinced himself of as October approached. Through calculated risks and strategic thinking, he had built his fortune, qualities he now recognized in Cordelia. More than a social union would be their marriage. A business partnership designed to revolutionize plantation management throughout the South was what it would be. That word of their unusual arrangement would reach ears beyond their trusted circle was anticipated by neither of them, setting in motion events that would transform their wedding celebration into something far more sinister. October 15, 1822, dawned with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Charleston County seem like a paradise on earth. For the wedding celebration, the Ravencraft plantation had been transformed, with white silk ribbons adorning the oak trees lining the main drive and tables laden with delicacies arranged across the mansion's expansive grounds. Throughout the morning, over 200 guests arrived, their carriages creating a procession that stretched for miles along the country roads. Some of the most powerful families in the Antebellum South were among the wedding guests. Governor Richardson himself attended along with plantation owners whose combined wealth could influence state and federal legislation, judges, and senators. In the plantation's garden pavilion, the ceremony took place, with Cordelia radiant in imported French silk and Ravencraft resplendent in his military dress uniform. But during the gift presentation ceremony, a tradition where the groom publicly announced his wedding present to his bride, the true significance of the day would emerge. This moment had been planned carefully by Ravencraft, understanding that his gift would be discussed in drawing rooms from Virginia to Louisiana for months to come. Standing before the assembled guests, Ravencraft called for attention and began what would become the most infamous wedding speech in South Carolina history. "My dear friends," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, "it is customary for a groom to present his bride with fine clothing, jewels, or perhaps a new carriage, but something far more practical and forward-thinking has been requested by my beloved Cordelia." With growing fascination, the crowd listened as Ravencraft described his gift, the legal ownership of 7 enslaved individuals, chosen specifically for their diverse skills and potential for what he termed innovative management approaches. His bride's business acumen and her desire to contribute actively to the plantation's prosperity through improved labor efficiency methods were spoken of by him. A respected military officer praising his wife's entrepreneurial spirit and commitment to plantation improvement was what the guests heard. That at that very moment, the 7 individuals in question were being forcibly separated from their families and relocated to the remote building where Cordelia's experiments would begin immediately following the wedding celebration was what they could not have known. Mixed, but generally positive, was the reaction among the wedding guests. To inquire about Cordelia's methods, several plantation owners approached Ravencraft throughout the evening, expressing interest in similar arrangements with their own wives. A progressive adaptation to changing economic conditions was how the idea of involving educated Southern ladies more directly in plantation management struck many. However, not everyone present viewed the announcement favorably. Deeply disturbed by the clinical language Ravencraft used when describing human beings as experimental subjects and management test cases was Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, the county physician who had treated enslaved individuals on multiple plantations. Similarly, fundamentally wrong with treating marriage gifts as opportunities for what sounded like systematic cruelty was what Reverend Samuel Hartwell, whose congregation included several plantation families, recognized. As the evening progressed and champagne flowed freely, additional details that should have alarmed more guests than they did were provided by Cordelia herself. She spoke enthusiastically about breaking family dependencies that interfere with labor efficiency and establishing new psychological frameworks for absolute obedience. With the same cheerful tone she used when discussing menu planning or flower arrangements, her words were delivered, making their sinister implications easy for intoxicated listeners to overlook. For 3 days, the wedding celebration continued as planned, with entertainment, dancing, and elaborate dinners that would be remembered as one of the finest social gatherings in the region's history. But while guests enjoyed themselves in the main mansion, in the remote building where the 7 enslaved individuals faced the beginning of Cordelia's experimental program, work had already begun. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of calculated cruelty and its devastating consequences. For several months, the true nature of Cordelia's methods would not become apparent to the outside world, but that they had become victims of something far more sinister than typical plantation brutality was understood immediately by the 7 individuals subjected to her experiments. Approximately 2 miles from the main plantation house sat the building Cordelia had designated for her experimental program, connected by a narrow path that wound through dense pine forest. Originally constructed as a tobacco drying barn during the plantation's early years, it had been extensively modified according to Cordelia's detailed specifications during the summer months leading up to her wedding. The structure now featured barred windows set too high to provide views of the surrounding area, reinforced walls, and a series of small rooms designed to house individuals in isolation when Cordelia deemed separation necessary for her psychological manipulation techniques. A central chamber she referred to as the instruction room was most disturbing. Punishment apparatus and restraining devices that went far beyond anything typically found on even the harshest plantations equipped it. 3 generations of a family that had served the Ravencroft plantation for over 30 years were represented by the 7 individuals chosen for Cordelia's experiment. Joshua and Rebecca Kane, both in their 50s, possessed valuable skills as a blacksmith and seamstress, respectively. Their 3 adult children, Samuel, aged 28, Mary, aged 26, and David, aged 24, had been trained in various plantation tasks and were considered among the most reliable workers on the property. Mary's 2 young children, ages 6 and 9, completed the family unit. Their strong emotional bonds and reputation for mutual support during difficult times was what made this family particularly valuable to Cordelia's purposes. That breaking these family connections would result in more compliant, productive workers who would focus entirely on their assigned tasks rather than maintaining relationships that might interfere with absolute obedience had been convinced by her research. With systematic isolation designed to destroy the family's communication and support systems, Cordelia's methods began. To separate living quarters, each individual was assigned and forbidden from speaking to other family members except during supervised work periods. At different times, meals were provided to prevent social interaction, and any attempt to communicate resulted in punishment that affected not just the individual involved but randomly selected family members. To deliberately false information designed to create mistrust and suspicion among family members, the psychological manipulation extended. That his son Samuel had spoken critically about his father's work performance would be told to Joshua by Cordelia while simultaneously informing Samuel that his father had requested additional punishment for his eldest son's alleged laziness. The trust and affection that had sustained the family through previous hardships were gradually eroded by these fabricated reports, which created tensions and doubts. But what she called productivity bonding was what involved Cordelia's most innovative and cruel technique. Against each other in various tasks, family members were forced to compete with the understanding that superior performance by one individual would result in better treatment while inferior performance would bring punishment not just to the underperformer but to their loved ones as well. A source of fear and guilt was what this system transformed natural family loyalty into, as each person's actions directly affected the welfare of those they cared about most. Ideal conditions for Cordelia's program were provided by the winter months, as shorter daylight hours meant longer periods of confinement and limited outside contact. Detailed written records of each individual's responses to her various techniques were maintained by her, noting changes in behavior, productivity levels, and signs of psychological breakdown with the same clinical precision she had once applied to managing her father's household accounts. Deliberately harsh, but not immediately life-threatening, were the physical conditions in the modified building. That dead or seriously injured subjects would provide no useful data and might attract unwanted attention from other plantation workers or visitors was understood by Cordelia. Instead, on creating constant discomfort and uncertainty that would wear down psychological resistance without causing visible evidence of mistreatment, she focused. Carefully calculated to maintain health while creating perpetual hunger that could be used as both punishment and reward were food rations. To prevent rest and recovery, sleeping arrangements were designed with thin mattresses, inadequate blankets, and deliberately uncomfortable sleeping positions that left individuals exhausted and more susceptible to psychological manipulation. Daily, throughout the winter months, Cordelia visited her experimental subjects, always accompanied by 2 trusted overseers who had been sworn to secrecy about the special arrangements. Their responses to her various techniques would be observed by her. Each individual separately would be interviewed to assess their psychological state, and her methods would be adjusted based on what she perceived as successful or unsuccessful approaches. That her systematic cruelty was creating something more dangerous than broken individuals was what Cordelia failed to anticipate. A group of people with nothing left to lose and every reason to seek revenge against those who had destroyed their lives was what it was forging. By February 1823, through the slave quarters of the main plantation, rumors about the mysterious building and its 7 missing occupants had begun circulating. For decades, the Kane family had been respected members of the community, known for their skills, their strong family bonds, and their willingness to help others during times of illness or personal crisis. An atmosphere of fear and suspicion among the remaining enslaved population had been created by their sudden disappearance and the strict prohibition against discussing their whereabouts. Quietly gathering information about what had happened to the missing family was begun by Martha Washington, an elderly woman who had served as an unofficial community leader for over 20 years. Opportunities to overhear conversations between Ravencroft, his new wife, and their visitors were provided by her position as head cook in the main house, while her respected status among the enslaved community made her a natural focal point for concerns and questions. A picture far more disturbing than typical plantation brutality was what Martha learned through careful observation and discreet inquiries painted. Specifically for their reputation for cruelty and their isolation from the main plantation community, had the 2 overseers assigned to the remote building been selected. Neither man had close friendships or family connections that might create conflicts of loyalty if they were asked to participate in activities that exceeded normal punishment protocols. The supplies that had been delivered to the building throughout the winter months were more troubling. Unusual items had been observed by Martha, medical instruments that seemed designed for inflicting pain rather than providing treatment, restraining devices that appeared far more sophisticated than typical plantation punishment equipment, and large quantities of materials that suggested extended confinement rather than temporary disciplinary measures. But perhaps most disturbing were the sounds that could occasionally be heard from the direction of the remote building during quiet winter nights. Hearing screams and cries that lasted for hours was reported by several plantation workers, followed by periods of absolute silence that seemed somehow more ominous than the sounds of obvious suffering. What she called prayer circles was begun to be organized by Martha, gatherings where enslaved individuals would meet in secret to share information about the missing family and discuss their concerns. Multiple purposes were served by these meetings. Emotional support for a community living under constant fear was provided by them. The exchange of information that might be useful for survival was facilitated by them. And a sense of unity and shared purpose that had previously been prevented by the plantation's size and the diverse backgrounds of its workers was begun to be fostered by them. Of Cordelia's activities that went far beyond what the wedding guests had heard described as innovative management techniques, a picture emerged through these gatherings. Systematic torture designed not just to punish but to break the human spirit in ways that would make individuals incapable of resistance or independent thought was what reports from those who had observed the building from a distance suggested. A means of preserving information that might otherwise be lost or forgotten were also served by the prayer circles. That detailed accounts of everything they learned about the missing family be memorized by multiple individuals was insisted upon by Martha, ensuring that evidence of what was happening would survive, even if those who gathered it were punished or sold to other plantations. As winter turned toward spring, into something more active than mere information sharing, these gatherings began to evolve. A sense of urgency that overcame the caution and resignation that typically characterized plantation life had been created by the realization that the Kane family's fate could befall any of them at any time. For the first time in the plantation's history, not just survival strategies, but the possibility of active resistance was begun to be discussed by enslaved workers. Meanwhile, among the white community as well, word of the Ravencroft plantation's experimental program had begun to spread, though in very different terms than the whispered fears circulating through the slave quarters. Meetings with Cordelia to learn about her innovative management techniques had been requested by several plantation owners from neighboring counties, and there was growing speculation that her methods might be adopted more widely throughout the region. Additional pressure for Cordelia to produce demonstrable results from her experimental program was created by this outside interest. Proof of concept for methods that might revolutionize plantation management throughout the antebellum South was what the 7 members of the Kane family had become no longer just subjects for her personal research. As a pioneer in plantation efficiency, Cordelia would be established by their complete psychological breakdown and transformation into perfectly obedient workers. While any failure might discredit both her methods and her reputation among the planter elite. The ultimate test of whether Cordelia's experimental subjects had been successfully transformed into the kind of workers she had promised would be provided by the approaching spring planting season. But as the days grew longer and warmer, that would ensure her experiment would be remembered for very different reasons than she had anticipated. Events were already in motion. To Charleston County, March 1823 brought unseasonably warm weather, along with the intensive preparations that preceded spring planting season. Enslaved workers prepared fields, repaired equipment, and organized supplies for the months of intensive labor that would determine the year's cotton crop and the plantation's financial success across the plantation. The culmination of her experimental program was what the approaching planting season represented for Cordelia. Back into the plantation's general labor force, the 7 members of the Kane family would be integrated after 5 months of systematic psychological manipulation, where their transformed behavior would demonstrate the effectiveness of her methods to both her husband and the growing number of plantation owners who had expressed interest in similar programs. But far different from what she had intended were the changes undergone by the individuals subjected to Cordelia's experiment. A shared understanding that their survival depended on eliminating the source of their torment, regardless of the consequences, was what they had developed rather than becoming broken. Compliant workers focused solely on their assigned tasks. With David Kane, the youngest of the adult siblings, whose natural leadership abilities had made him a particular target for Cordelia's psychological manipulation techniques, the transformation had begun. A cold, calculating intelligence that focused entirely on finding ways to strike back against those who had destroyed his family, had been instead fostered by repeated attempts to break his spirit through punishment and isolation. In isolation, working, denied communication with his relatives, David had spent the winter months memorizing every detail of the building's layout, the patterns of Cordelia's visits, and the routines of the overseers. He had observed how sound carried between different sections of the building, where tools and potential weapons were stored, and which doors remained unlocked during different times of day. More importantly, despite Cordelia's elaborate isolation protocols, ways to communicate with his family members had been found by David. The Kane family had maintained contact and begun coordinating their responses to their captors' demands through a system of coded sounds, hidden messages, and carefully timed gestures. The development of a sophisticated conspiracy focused on a single objective, escape or revenge, was what the apparent gradual breakdown of family bonds actually was. On March 15, when Cordelia decided to implement what she called the final integration test, the breaking point came. Permanently separated from her mother would be Mary Kane's 6-year-old daughter, little Sarah, and assigned to work in the main house, where her mother would be able to see her daily but never speak to her again. Whether the psychological conditioning had been successful in eliminating inappropriate emotional attachments that interfered with work efficiency would be demonstrated by this separation, Cordelia explained to her overseers. But when the overseers came to collect Sarah that morning, they found the Kane family prepared for something very different than passive compliance. But not into broken, obedient workers, they had become a coordinated unit focused entirely on survival and retribution, with nothing left to lose and no remaining faith that submission would protect them from further cruelty. Had the months of systematic torture indeed transformed them? When David Kane refused to allow the overseers to take his niece, the confrontation began. The calculated challenge of someone who had prepared for this moment for months was his defiance, not the desperate resistance of someone acting on impulse. The combined resistance of 7 people who had decided that death was preferable to continued torture was what the first overseer found himself facing when he moved to strike David for his insubordination. The systematic execution of a plan that had been developed over months of careful observation and preparation was what followed, not the chaotic violence of desperate people. Their captors' weaknesses had been identified by the Kane family, the building's vulnerabilities had been learned, and themselves for the consequences of active resistance had been prepared by them. They were ready when the moment came. The 2 overseers assigned to guard them were experienced in controlling individual slaves through intimidation and punishment. But for coordinated resistance from a group that no longer feared death, they were unprepared. Both men were dead within minutes, killed not in a frenzy of anger, but through the careful application of tools and techniques that David and his family had planned with the same precision Cordelia had used to design their torment. But only the beginning of what the Kane family had planned for this day was killing their immediate captors. They had spent months preparing for the opportunity to confront the person truly responsible for their suffering, memorizing her routines, and listening to Cordelia's daily visits. And on the morning of March 15th, they knew exactly where to find her. With the same methodical approach she had applied to every aspect of her experimental program, Cordelia Ravencroft began March 15th. After breakfast with her husband in the main house dining room, the supplies needed for the morning's integration test were gathered by her, her daily observation notes were collected, and she set out along the familiar path through the pine forest toward the remote building where her subjects awaited her arrival. The sweet scent of early spring flowers and the sounds of plantation life beginning another day were carried by the morning air. Their voices and the sounds of their tools creating a backdrop of productive activity that reinforced Cordelia's conviction that her experimental methods would soon revolutionize plantation management throughout the South. Field hands were already at work preparing for the coming planting season. With the confident stride of someone who had never encountered resistance she could not overcome through careful planning and systematic application of pressure, she walked. Exactly according to her expectations had the 5 months of her experimental program proceeded, with each of the 7 subjects showing precisely the kind of psychological transformation that would make them ideal workers once they were integrated back into the plantation's general labor force. A scene that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives, was what Cordelia discovered when she reached the building. Killed with tools and techniques that demonstrated both planning and intimate knowledge of human anatomy lay the 2 overseers dead in the central instruction room. But far more disturbing than their deaths was the evidence of systematic preparation that surrounded their bodies. Into something very different from what Cordelia had intended, had the Kane family used their months of confinement to transform the building. Escape routes had been prepared, tools had been modified into weapons, and supplies had been gathered for what was clearly a carefully planned confrontation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. But most disturbing of all was the realization that the 7 individuals she had believed were broken and compliant had instead been preparing for this moment with the same methodical precision she had used to design their torment, studying her vulnerabilities, learning her routines, and watching her. No longer the psychologically shattered individual Cordelia believed she had created, but someone whose intelligence and determination had been focused entirely on survival and retribution. David Kane stood in the center of the instruction room. In the coordinated formation of individuals who had planned every detail of what would happen next, his family stood with him, arranged not in the random positions of desperate people. "Mistress Cordelia," David said, his voice carrying none of the deference and submission that 5 months of torture were supposed to have instilled, "for you to arrive, we have been waiting. We have something we want to discuss." The methodical presentation of a case that the Kane family had prepared over months of careful observation and analysis was what followed, not a conversation in any conventional sense. Every aspect of Cordelia's experimental program had been documented by them, every detail of her methods had been memorized, and a comprehensive account of what had been done to them and why had been prepared. But simply to confront their tormentor with evidence of her cruelty was not their purpose. That Cordelia's experimental program was intended as a model for wider implementation and that their suffering was designed to establish methods that would be applied to enslaved individuals throughout the region had been realized by the Kane family. That Cordelia's methods died with her program would not be ensured unless they took steps. Their escape would not save others from similar fate. Far more dangerous than a rebellious slave had David Kane become. He had become someone who understood exactly how the plantation system worked, who could anticipate the responses of authorities to slave rebellion, and who had developed a comprehensive plan not just for escape, but for ensuring that evidence of Cordelia's experiments would reach people capable of taking action to prevent similar programs. The calculated execution of justice by individuals who had been transformed by their suffering into something their captors had never anticipated was what the confrontation that morning was, not the desperate violence of people with nothing left to lose. Later that day, when Cordelia's body was discovered, a story that authorities would spend decades trying to suppress would be told by the manner of her death. But far beyond personal revenge extended the Kane family's plan. They had prepared evidence, gathered documentation, and established contacts that would ensure their story reached ears beyond the local authorities who might be motivated to cover up scandals that could damage the reputation of prominent plantation families. At approximately 2 o'clock on the afternoon of March 15, when her failure to return from her daily visit to the experimental facility had become cause for concern, Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft discovered his wife's body. Not only his understanding of his wife's activities, but the entire trajectory of his life and the legacy of his family name would be reshaped by what he found in the remote building. In the central instruction room, surrounded by evidence of the experimental program that had consumed her attention for the previous 5 months, lay Cordelia. But something far more disturbing was what Ravencroft encountered rather than the scene of random violence that might be expected from a slave rebellion, the systematic documentation and presentation of evidence that revealed the true nature of what his wife had been doing to the 7 members of the Kane family. Into what could only be described as a museum of cruelty had the building itself been transformed, with every psychological manipulation technique, every restraining device, and every tool carefully arranged and labeled to demonstrate the comprehensive nature of Cordelia's experimental program. In a manner that would leave no doubt about the deliberate, systematic nature of what had been done to the missing family, written documentation, including Cordelia's own detailed notes, had been organized and presented. A comprehensive written account, obviously prepared over many weeks, that detailed not only what had been done to the Kane family, but Cordelia's plans for expanding her methods throughout the plantation and her correspondence with other plantation owners who had expressed interest in similar programs was most disturbing of all. That what Ravencroft had understood as an isolated experiment was actually intended as the foundation for a regional transformation of plantation management techniques was revealed by the document. Completely had the Kane family themselves vanished, leaving behind only the evidence of their months of suffering and a clear indication that their escape had been planned with the same systematic precision that characterized everything else about the confrontation. Nothing that belonged to the plantation had been taken by them, nothing beyond what was necessary to eliminate their captors had been destroyed by them, and a complete record that would make any cover-up attempt extraordinarily difficult had been left behind by them. Preventing the discovery from becoming public knowledge that would destroy not only his own reputation, but the standing of every plantation owner who had been associated with Cordelia's experimental program was Ravencroft's immediate concern. Within hours of finding his wife's body, trusted riders had been dispatched by him to contact other members of the planter elite who needed to be warned about the potential scandal and enlisted in efforts to control the narrative. Swift and coordinated was the response. To assess the situation and develop strategies for preventing the truth about Cordelia's experimental program from reaching newspapers that might use the information to attack the entire plantation system or authorities, representatives from some of the most powerful families in South Carolina had arrived at the Ravencroft plantation by evening. Evidence so damning that traditional cover-up methods would be inadequate was what they discovered. Risks that extended far beyond damage to individual reputations were created by the systematic nature of Cordelia's cruelty, the involvement of other plantation owners in planning similar programs, and the comprehensive documentation left behind by the Kane family. What they called comprehensive suppression was the decision made to implement a coordinated effort that involved political authorities at the state level, regional newspapers, and local law enforcement. That Cordelia Ravencroft had been killed during a random slave rebellion that was quickly suppressed with the perpetrators captured and executed to prevent similar incidents would be the official story. But eliminating all evidence of the experimental program, including the building itself and everyone who had knowledge of what had actually occurred, was required for creating a believable alternative narrative. Over the following weeks, a systematic campaign of bribery, intimidation, and threats would be implemented to ensure that no one who had witnessed evidence of Cordelia's activities would be able or willing to share that information with outside authorities. As victims of unprovoked violence were the 2 overseers who had been killed described, with no mention of their role in Cordelia's experimental program. As captured and executed were the 7 members of the Kane family reported, though no public executions took place and no bodies were ever produced. Completely was the remote building dismantled, with its materials burned and scattered to eliminate any physical evidence of what had occurred there. Most importantly, in any form, too dangerous to allow survival was declared the comprehensive written account left behind by the Kane family. And tracking down every version would require resources and coordination that extended across state boundaries and involved individuals whose own reputations depended on keeping the truth buried. Multiple copies had apparently been prepared. That their efforts to suppress evidence of Cordelia's experimental program would create exactly the kind of mystery and speculation that would keep the story alive for generations was what the conspirators could not have anticipated. Into the kind of legend that would be whispered about in slave quarters and abolitionist meetings for decades to come would their success in eliminating official records transform the Ravencroft plantation tragedy. The coordinated cover-up effort that followed Cordelia's death succeeded in preventing immediate public exposure of her experimental program, but it could not prevent the systematic destruction of everything the Ravencroft family had built over 2 generations. Within months of the March 15 incident, forces had been set in motion that would reduce Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft from one of South Carolina's most respected planters to a broken man whose family name would become synonymous with scandal and shame. In late April, when unsigned letters began appearing in the offices of abolitionist newspapers throughout the North, came the first indication that the cover-up was failing. Detailed descriptions of Cordelia's experimental program were contained in these letters, accompanied by information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of both the plantation's operations and the subsequent cover-up efforts. By someone with education and sophisticated understanding of how to present evidence in ways that would be credible to skeptical readers were the letters clearly written. They included specific details about plantation layouts, names of overseers, descriptions of equipment used in the experimental program, and, most damaging of all, direct quotes from correspondence between Cordelia and other plantation owners who had expressed interest in implementing similar methods. Their timing was what made these revelations particularly devastating. Throughout the North, momentum was being gained by the abolitionist movement, and exactly the kind of documentation that reformers needed to support their arguments about the inherent brutality of the slavery system was provided by evidence of systematic torture programs on Southern plantations. Within weeks, a centerpiece of anti-slavery publications and speaking tours had the Ravencroft plantation story become. But from within the Southern planter community itself came the real destruction. Questions they could not answer without admitting their own involvement in planning systematic torture were found to be facing by the other plantation owners who had been associated with Cordelia's experimental program. They began distancing themselves from Ravencroft one by one, canceling business relationships and spreading rumors designed to shift blame entirely onto the colonel and his deceased wife. Effectively ostracized from the social and business networks that formed the foundation of plantation society, had Ravencroft been by summer 1823. Reasons to call in loans or refuse credit extensions were suddenly found by banks that had previously competed for his business. Immediate payment for goods that had traditionally been purchased on seasonal credit arrangements was begun to be demanded by merchants who had provided supplies for decades. Most devastating of all, any contact with Ravencroft's plantation was begun to be actively discouraged by other plantation owners from their enslaved workers, treating it as a source of dangerous ideas about rebellion and resistance. Increasingly precarious was made Ravencroft's situation by political isolation that accompanied the economic pressure. A liability became his military rank, which had opened doors throughout South Carolina's political establishment, as officials worried that association with him might damage their own reputations. Stopped arriving were invitations to social gatherings. Without explanation, business partnerships dissolved, and excuses to avoid encounters that might be observed by others were found by former friends. But perhaps most devastating was the effect on the plantation's enslaved population. Throughout the region, word of the Kane family's successful resistance had spread, creating what authorities described as dangerous excitement among enslaved individuals who had previously accepted their situation with resignation. A symbol of successful resistance became the Ravencroft plantation, and increasingly expensive security measures that further strained the plantation's deteriorating finances were required for maintaining control over the remaining workers. More than a community leader among the enslaved population had become Martha Washington, the elderly cook who had organized the prayer circles during the winter months. Into a comprehensive intelligence network that extended across multiple plantations and even into the free black communities of Charleston itself, had her efforts to document and preserve information about the Kane family's fate evolved. In ways that had never existed before the Ravencroft incident, detailed information about plantation vulnerabilities, overseer weaknesses, and opportunities for resistance was being shared and coordinated through this network. The foundation for organized resistance activities that terrified plantation owners throughout the region had become what had begun as an attempt to preserve the memory of 7 tortured individuals. When a series of coordinated incidents across multiple plantations demonstrated that the Kane family's resistance had inspired something far more dangerous than isolated acts of rebellion, came the final blow to Ravencroft's dynasty in autumn 1823. Systematically sabotaged was equipment, overseers began disappearing, and crops were destroyed in ways that suggested careful planning rather than random violence. That the resistance activities were being coordinated by individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of plantation operations, security procedures, and the personal vulnerabilities of owners and overseers was evidence most alarming to authorities. That someone with intimate understanding of how the plantation system functioned was directing activities designed to destroy it from within was suggested by the systematic nature of the attacks. Increasingly desperate and expensive became Colonel Ravencroft's attempts to maintain control over his own plantation. He hired additional overseers, implemented new security measures, and even constructed fortified buildings designed to protect against coordinated attacks. But each new precaution required resources he could no longer afford, while demonstrating to the remaining enslaved population that their resistance was having the desired effect. By December 1823, an armed camp with guards patrolling constantly, workers confined to quarters except during supervised labor periods, and an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made productive work nearly impossible had become the plantation that had once been the pride of Charleston County. Completely had the cotton crop failed. To systematic sabotage, livestock had been lost, and deliberate damage that occurred despite round-the-clock security measures was shown by the buildings themselves. Through the simple arithmetic of financial collapse came the end, not through dramatic confrontation. The security measures necessary to protect his plantation could no longer be afforded by Ravencroft, but he could not risk reducing them without inviting the kind of comprehensive destruction that had befallen other properties in the region. Faced with bankruptcy and the certainty that his situation would only worsen, the decision that would complete the destruction of his family's legacy was made by him. On January 3, 1824, an announcement that sent shock waves through South Carolina's planter elite and provided the final piece of evidence that abolitionists needed to document the systematic brutality underlying the plantation system was made by Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft. Standing in the parlor of his crumbling mansion, surrounded by furniture that would soon be sold to pay creditors, he confessed the full truth about his wife's experimental program and his own role in concealing evidence of her crimes. By the calculated recognition that his enemies already possessed enough information to destroy him completely was the confession motivated, not by remorse or moral awakening. That his former allies had abandoned him to protect their own interests, by controlling the narrative of his own downfall. Ravencroft hoped to salvage some remnant of dignity while ensuring that others who had participated in planning similar experimental programs would face consequences for their involvement. A network of correspondence and collaboration that extended far beyond his own plantation was what Ravencroft revealed. Across dozens of plantations throughout South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, Cordelia's experimental program had been designed as a pilot project for methods that would be implemented. Standard practices that would revolutionize plantation management and increase profits by breaking the human spirit so completely that resistance would become psychologically impossible were what the systematic torture techniques she had developed were intended to become. Names, dates, and specific details about other plantation owners who had provided funding, advice, and resources for Cordelia's experiments were included in the confession. That the innovative management techniques discussed at their wedding had been the culmination of months of coordination among some of the South's most prominent families, all of whom had agreed to implement similar programs on their own properties once Cordelia's methods had been proven effective was revealed by it. Most damaging of all, that local authorities, including sheriffs, judges, and political officials, had been informed about the experimental program and had agreed to provide protection from legal consequences in exchange for promises that successful techniques would be shared with their own business interests was revealed by Ravencroft's confession. Coordinated perjury, destruction of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses at levels that reached into the highest circles of state government had been involved in the cover-up effort that followed Cordelia's death. But information that he could not have intended to make public was also revealed by Ravencroft's confession. About the Kane family's escape that demonstrated their resistance had been far more sophisticated and far-reaching than anyone had suspected were details. According to documents he had recovered during his investigation of the March 15 incident, the 7 family members had not simply fled to freedom, but had established contact with abolitionist networks that enabled them to provide detailed intelligence about plantation vulnerabilities throughout the region. Abilities that went far beyond what any plantation owner had recognized had apparently been possessed by David Kane, the young man whose leadership had coordinated his family's resistance. His understanding of the plantation system's weaknesses, his ability to forge connections across racial and social boundaries, and his talent for organizing coordinated resistance activities, had made him something unprecedented in the antebellum South, an enslaved individual who had become a strategic threat to the entire system of human bondage. Information that enabled resistance activities, escape routes, and even economic sabotage that was coordinated across state boundaries was being provided by the intelligence network that David Kane had established. Equipment failures, crop diseases, and worker reliability problems that seemed to strike multiple properties simultaneously in ways that suggested deliberate coordination were found to be dealing with by plantation owners who had never heard of the Ravencroft experimental program. To contacts in northern cities where former enslaved individuals were providing information and resources that enabled increasingly sophisticated resistance operations, had authorities tracked some of this activity, Ravencroft's confession revealed. Simply escaped to freedom had not the Kane family. Part of a growing network of individuals whose intimate knowledge of plantation operations was being used to systematically undermine the economic foundation of the slavery system had they become. That enslaved individuals were developing the kind of organizational capabilities and strategic thinking that had previously been considered impossible under the conditions of bondage was evidence that terrified Southern authorities more than individual acts of rebellion. That systematic cruelty designed to break human spirit could instead forge individuals into something far more dangerous than compliant workers had been demonstrated by the Ravencroft incident. The ultimate fate of Cordelia herself was what the confession's most shocking revelation concerned. According to documents that Ravencroft had discovered, but initially concealed, his wife had not been killed during the March 15 confrontation. Instead, she had been taken alive by the Kane family, who had subjected her to a carefully planned psychological demonstration of her own experimental techniques before allowing her to die from injuries that were inflicted with the same systematic precision she had used to torture others. That Cordelia had spent her final hours experiencing every technique she had developed for breaking human spirit administered by individuals who had intimate knowledge of her methods and unlimited motivation to ensure she understood exactly how her victims had suffered was what the evidence suggested. A comprehensive education in the consequences of treating other human beings as experimental subjects for systematic cruelty had been her death, rather quick nor merciful. That the greatest horrors in American history often emerged not from supernatural forces, but from the calculated cruelty that humans can inflict upon one another when they convince themselves that some lives matter less than others is what this mystery shows us. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the Charleston County archives? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell and share with someone who loves mysteries. The shadows of America's past hold many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we'll be here to explore them with you. In February 1824, the Ravencroft plantation was abandoned. Its buildings left to decay while creditors fought over assets that proved insufficient to cover the colonel's debts. Shortly after making his confession, Thaddeus Ravencroft himself disappeared, with some reports suggesting he had fled to Mexico, while others claimed he had taken his own life rather than face the consequences of his revelations. But far beyond the destruction of a single family's fortune extended the true legacy of the Ravencroft incident. Symbols that influenced both the abolitionist movement and the evolution of plantation management techniques throughout the antebellum period became the experimental program that Cordelia had designed and the resistance network that the Kane family had inspired. In the North, documentation that supported their arguments about the inherent brutality of slavery was provided to abolitionists by detailed accounts of Cordelia's systematic torture methods. Required reading in anti-slavery societies became the Ravencroft Confession and helped convince previously neutral observers that the plantation system was fundamentally incompatible with American principles of human dignity and Christian values. More importantly, a source of inspiration for enslaved individuals throughout the South who had previously accepted their situation as unchangeable became the story of the Kane family's successful resistance. That 7 people had not only survived systematic torture, but had successfully escaped and established networks for helping others demonstrated that resistance was possible even under the most oppressive conditions. Long after the Ravencroft plantation's collapse, continued operating were the intelligence networks that David Kane had established, providing information and resources that enabled escape routes, resistance activities, and economic sabotage that contributed to the growing instability of the slavery system. By the 1850s, problems that seemed to indicate coordinated opposition rather than isolated incidents of rebellion were being dealt with by plantation owners throughout the region. Perhaps most significantly, that systematic cruelty designed to break human spirit could instead forge individuals into something far more dangerous than compliant workers was demonstrated by the Ravencroft incident. Into strategic thinkers whose understanding of the plantation system's vulnerabilities enabled them to strike back in ways that their tormentors had never anticipated had the 7 members of the Kane family been transformed by their suffering. A destination for curious visitors and a source of local legends that persisted well into the 20th century became the abandoned Ravencroft plantation. About mysterious lights in the ruins of the main house, unexplained sounds from the location where the experimental building had stood, and sightings of figures that seemed to be searching for something among the overgrown cotton fields, stories circulated. But that the greatest horrors in human history often emerge not from supernatural forces but from the calculated decisions of individuals who convince themselves that some lives matter less than others was perhaps its most enduring legacy demonstrated by the Ravencroft tragedy. The product of careful planning by educated, socially prominent individuals who had rationalized cruelty as business innovation was the systematic torture that Cordelia had designed, not of mental illness or sudden passion. Evidence of how the plantation system functioned and how resistance networks developed in response to systematic oppression continue to provide historians with the documents that survived the cover-up effort, scattered across archives from Charleston to Boston. Rare insight into both the brutal calculations that sustained human bondage and the sophisticated strategies that enslaved individuals developed to resist and ultimately undermine their oppressors is offered by the Ravencroft Papers, as they came to be known. Today, only by foundation stones and a historical marker that provides a sanitized account of the property's significance in the region's agricultural development is marked the site where the Ravencroft plantation once stood. But for those who know where to look, evidence remains of the experimental building where 7 individuals endured months of systematic torture before transforming their suffering into the foundation for a resistance network that would contribute to the eventual collapse of the system that had enslaved them. A reminder that the shadows of America's past continue to shape our present and that the most important historical lessons often come from confronting the uncomfortable truths about what humans are capable of doing to one another when systems of power convince them that cruelty can be justified as progress. Serves the true story of Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft and his wife's wedding gift of 7 human beings.